Hello friends, today we're going to be talking about Neptune's ingress into the sign of Aries for the final time on January 26, 2026. And Neptune's going to stay in the sign of Aries until 2038, with a final short dip back into the sign of Aries in late 2038 until March of 2039, and then Neptune will be in the sign of Taurus. So this is marking the beginning of a long cycle, and this cycle is going to shape how we experience our own initiative, conviction, courage, and actions for more than a decade. With this ingress, Neptune's asking us to put our money where our mouth is, all the things that we came to believe, the ideologies we accumulated in the sign of Pisces. It's going to be asking us, can you now act it out? And it's important to say this at the outset. Neptune alters our perception, and Aries initiates motion. So when Neptune comes into the sign of Aries, the way we act becomes inseparable from what we believe. And this connection between perception and action is what is going to inform our impulses. It's the way that we're going to be able to get our motivation and how we decide something should be done. And if you think about it, this is super important because often it is our actions that creates the consequences of our lives. And Aries, through and through, is a sign of action. So this means that for the duration of Neptune in Aries, if we are mindful, which we should be, we need to pay attention to the underlying reasons when it comes to our actions because they're being informed by our ideas, ideologies, and our perception. We have to understand how Neptune's fueling this. And before getting to breaking all of these significations and bringing them together, there'll be plenty of videos coming up about Neptune and the sign of Aries. I mean, if I'm still doing these videos, if I'm still alive, there'll be a ton of videos on this playlist. But the next one will be the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. And if you want to catch that video, please do press subscribe so YouTube sends you a notification. And before getting to the depth of this, I want to give you the structure of this video because it's going to be a little bit longer than our usual video. So I'm going to break down what Aries is and then what Neptune is, bring Neptune into the sign of Aries, talk about his shadows. This is very important. And then the life lessons related to this placement. And this video will be timestamped, so you can feel free to go back and forth as you need to. Now, let's begin with Aries and understand that component so that we understand what kind of script Aries is handing over to Neptune and what Neptune has to do in the sign of Aries. And one way that we can start is to say, Aries corresponds to the moment existence enters visibility. It's the spark that ignites life into life. And Aries is linked to the cardinal east. And the east represents the border where potential individuates and becomes manifest. Before this point, in the sign of Pisces, previous to Aries, everything exists in its latent potential as mere potential. It's Aries that takes that undifferentiated potential, differentiate it, and then declares, I am here, I exist. So when potential enters into the sign of Aries, existence in its existing forms are underway. So we can see why Aries represents inception. It is the mode of operation that initiates motion without delay. And this is also why the sign of Aries carries qualities like self-determination, independence, bravery, and strength. And it's important to say these are some personality traits that are later on added to the significations of Aries. They are the structural requirement for emergence. And it's worth remembering to emerge in that cardinal east is to emerge as something that's separate than other entities. And to separate is to assert. And to assert requires expenditure of energy. So you can see logically and coherently how all of these symbolisms are coming out of Aries. And this brings us to the fire element of Aries, because when we look at a sign, we have to look at these different components to understand what kind of script they're handing to the planets. And what we can say about Aries fire is that it's representing existence as an active force. It's where fire initiates activity. It's where things get compelled to move, to assert their will. And it's introducing an outward and an upward direction into the system. Like fire spreads out, and as it grows, it gets bigger and goes higher and higher towards the heavens. And if you think about it, when fire advances forward, it consumes everything. And generally, when we talk about Aries passion, this consumption is part of it. And when we talk about Aries in the human realm, we're talking about one-pointed motion. What we call our focus, our determination, and our motivation. And another thing worth mentioning about the sign of Aries, the ruler is Mars, the god of war. And both the sign of Aries and Mars move outwards and they externalize. It's like an extroverted energy. And Mars, like its own sign, it never hesitates. And that's because hesitation fractures the integrity of emergence. And another thing I want us to keep in mind about the sign of Aries, because this will come into the discussion, all these points will come into our discussion when Neptune's there and we bring Neptune into the sign of Aries, is the purpose of life that's associated to the sign of Aries. Because as a fire sign, it is considered a dharmic sign. So it's a sign that's related to dharma. And dharma here functions as the inherent law of something. It's governing how potential has to move in order to become manifest. Therefore, dharma is embedded in the nature of the thing. So you have a dharma based on your composition, the manifestation that you are, as I have my own. And this means that we direct ourselves towards a particular type or kind of action. And when our action actually follows this inherent dharma that's invested within, all of life has its internal coherency. Even when we go through hard times, there's an internal coherency moving through it because we are aligned, the way our soul has its mandate to move. And I think that's enough, but hold these definitions in mind because it's the only way to understand why Neptune's going to behave the way that it will in the sign of Aries. And now let's quickly go through the significations of Neptune and see what Neptune's about. We can describe Neptune as the notion of transcendence of the temporal world, with all of its order and limitation. Neptune dissolves the boundaries that we have between the self and the other. It dissolves the boundaries between inner and outer, the imagined and what's actually real. When Neptune's functioning at its highest point, it gives a sense of devotion, compassion, spiritual experiences, the emergence of poetry, myth, and art. But at its lowest level, it produces tremendous amount of confusion, projection, distortion, illusions, and delusions. And all of this is because the function of Neptune is about diffusing things. You know, when you have a light going through a prism, you have like this laser beam going through it, and then it gets fractured, diffuses, and you can see the colors of the rainbow, the entire light spectrum. For this reason, the fact that it diffuses, Neptune can alter perception. It can soften the sharp edges of a structure and a system. It blurs things together. So what this does, it hinders the way that we normally define what's real, what constitutes as reality. So Neptune can alter the way meaning is formed. And if you think about it, what we actually think is the truth are the set of definition that have resonance to us. So it can also change what is true. And also because Neptune represents this fusion, and because it represents dissolving boundaries, it can come to symbolize psychological fusion. And that means our inner images start to merge with our outer experiences. Beliefs can become super saturated because of this. And our ideals can take on absolute significance, overseeding and overruling reality. And this is how Neptune governs mythology and ideology. It gives the symbolic narrative enough power to feel real. It makes it feel timeless and unquestionable. And when you think about this boundary dissolving component of Neptune, it's describing primary narcissism. And we all had it as infants. Up to the age of 2, we all have a healthy dose of primary narcissism. It's actually a state of infancy. It's the psychological state where we can't differentiate ourselves, let's say with our mother or a caregiver, ourselves and the world. It's one merged state, one sense of oneness, a sense of oneness. So this idea of self and world remains very fluid. And in this kind of a state, if you think about it, experience is very immersive. It's unmediated. It's undivided. So if you think about it, if the state of primary narcissism stays with us as an adult, it's denoting a manifestation of entitlements. And that entitlement's actually coming from the confusion of not understanding these boundaries where things are separated from each other. Like what belongs to the self and what belongs to the other. It's blurring those boundaries. And not to mention with Neptune, imagined perception becomes dominant and it can override facts. And for this reason, the images that are in the mind can start to inform how we ought to act in the world. So in some ways, If you think about it, when we're thinking about Neptune in the sign of Aries, is amping up our convictions. And because of that diffusing component that's here, that's blurring boundaries, softening the edges of structures, it's actually replacing structural clarity that we need to orient our actions. Now imagine what happens when this force enters Aries. Aries initiates motion. Neptune is dissolving perceptual boundaries, and Neptune in Aries is initiating actions through altered perception. So let's just bring Neptune in the sign of Aries and see what it's all about. Now we're on to section 3 because we define Aries and Neptune. Now Neptune in the sign of Aries. Neptune brings beliefs in the sign of Aries into the seat of initiation. For one, actions can emerge from our inner images, imaginings, ideas, ideals, fantasies, and beliefs. And not to mention, Neptune has no choice but to externalize all of these qualities that it has in the sign of Aries, because that's what Aries is about. So that means what was once internalized, imagined, symbolic, even a fantasy, now wants to have an expression through its actions, even through confrontation, assertion, and aggression. So when Neptune's here, we might very well feel compelled to act on our vision of what we think should be, what must be, what our imagination feels like it is the inevitable now. So in a lot of ways, courage is being fueled by belief now, and passion becomes fueled by ideals. And we have to remember this. Aries is a very quick sign, and it externalizes actions very quickly. And in the sign of Aries, just by itself, a lot of times we can act and then be like, oh my God, I should have thought about that. So it's always act first, think later. So actions coming before understanding. And if you think about if we're now operating on the premise of our beliefs, we can have unexamined beliefs and we're acting them out in the world. It becomes our behavior. And at the same time, because this concept of belief now has the power of actions behind it, it can create a surge of purpose. Like, I am so purposeful in the way that I want to be acting right now. They're coming as strong convictions with this great sense of urgency, like a sense that something has to be done now, immediately. And the way that we get conditioned to act, that repetition starts to identify our identities, how we come to identify ourselves. And since so much of the actions are being fueled by ideas, ideologies, and beliefs, and if we don't examine these beliefs, we'll find ourselves playing roles, these imagined roles that come with these beliefs, which are essentially defined by the ideals. Just because the conviction's there, now there's that propulsion system to act it out. That's what I was saying earlier. Whatever that happened in the sign of Pisces, however way you came to define yourself, whatever your idealism, your ideas are, whether if I'm super spiritual, I'm super divinely feminine or masculine, I am on the right, I am on the left. These are all ideologies and beliefs. Now, it's going to be about acting it out. And hopefully they've been thought out because we feel compelled to externalize them now. And you know what? On one hand, this can inspire meaningful initiative. On the other hand, it can seriously amplify some serious distortions. And again, that's because Neptune blurs the lines between what's real and what is merely being imagined. So under this transit, motivation can feel self-justifying, and actions can feel aligned because they feel like they're meaningful, because it's coming from that place of conviction. But sometimes when we zoom out, it's like, oh my God, my whole belief system was out of whack. So it would be so good if we take some time to examine things. And I think Saturn is going to help us do that. But that's a topic for the next video. But all of this also sets the stage for the shadows of this placement. And when we talk about the 3 outer planets, we really have to talk about their shadows. And that's because when we take Neptune into consideration, and whenever we have actions that are fueled by beliefs that are not grounded in reality, we get a lot of consequences, the shadows. So I'm going to go through 5 shadows. There are plenty more than 5. And in the future videos, I'll make sure to bring up more as is relevant to the topic of the video. But we're going to look at 5 primary shadows of Neptune in Aries. And I would say that the first shadow of Neptune in Aries is when we mistake imagination for necessity. And I want us to keep in mind, the sign of Aries by itself is very Spartan-like. This is Mars' sign, so there's a sense of practicality, not in a Saturnine kind of way, but the simplicity of a straight line trajectory. I'm not going to wander off to go check that thing out and that. Like a bullet that comes out of a gun, it's a straight line. It's the pathway that is absolutely necessary to reach my destination. Sorry, my voice was going there. And mistaking imagination for necessities is coming from Neptune. And that's because Neptune is filling the psyche with images, ideals, symbolic narratives. And Aries doesn't care. It just basically translates that like an RNA, copying the DNA into actions. So we can have a lot of this feeling during this transit that something needs to be done now, immediately. And we believe that it has to be done. But if we were to zoom out, the situation itself doesn't objectively require it. And we can see the shadows coming from the fact that Neptune's blurring the lines between what is actually real and what's imagined. The internal reality and the external reality are actually not matching up. Like what feels internally feels so compelling that you just have to act upon it. So this creates a lot of impulsive commitment, which then creates a lot of havoc. That means we can compulsively initiate new paths with enormous amount of urgency. Rather than taking a step back, looking at our actual lived conditions, our means, what we're actually able to do, what kind of support system do we have, and then act. And we have to realize once when action's initiated in the sign of Aries, it has no choice but to carry these actions forward in that straight line and in that trajectory to its destination. So it's intense. Psychologically, once when you're on this trajectory in the sign of Aries, it's very hard to put a brake on it and then to change your trajectory. The velocity is so high, is generating so much force and power, you just can't stir it to the other side. It just keeps going. And if you think about it, how many times can you do this until 2039 and not feel completely exhausted? This is the ingredients for regret, repeated failure, where we look back and we're like, oh my God, this is not where I was intending to arrive. And you know what? None of this might happen because our actions in principle were wrong, but because it was driven by imagined necessity in the moment, impulsively, compulsively, rather than assessing what is absolutely necessary. Now we go to shadow number 2, and that's when belief fuses with identity. And as I mentioned earlier, Neptune dissolves separation between things. On the other hand, Aries is trying to individuate and assert identity through action. So when they combine, we can begin to experience our beliefs as an extension of our existence. To question our beliefs, or if someone questions our beliefs, it can feel like an existential threat. And this shadow is emerging because Neptune amplifies ideals, this imaginary realm, and Aries is going to externalize them for self-definition. So it's very likely that we can act, fight, and assert in order to preserve the image of who we think we are or who it is that we're meant to become. And you know what? There's a bit of it when you think about it. This is also happening because this placement is creating a kind of a mental rigidity, like a psychological rigidity, and that's what's creating the havoc. And I say this because when we believe in something, when there's a conviction and someone challenges us, and then we come to think, our ego is so connected to it that we start to think that our existence being threatened. Dialogue is impossible with that type of person, or with us when we get into that kind of a mode. Opposition generally feels like an attack. So conflict can escalate when someone's identity feels threatened. And when you think about our times right now, the way people have separated themselves, created these tribes, groups that are based on this rigid identity, like to challenge that during this time until 2039 is like fighting fire with fire. And when we think about it, this kind of rigidity, this shadow of Neptune in Aries, destroys relationships. It fractures our human connections, polarizes communities, and it's actually entrapping us inside of these roles that we never chose consciously. They just come with that identity that we'll keep enacting, and we so deeply believe in it. So we're just compelled to keep fighting and defending. This is a huge shadow of this placement. But let's go to shadow number 3, and this shadow is about projection. And that's because Neptune straight up represents projection. And it's able to do this because it dissolves the boundaries between the inner content and the external reality. It's blurring the lines. In a lot of ways, with Neptune, it's very difficult to know where one begins and ends. And it's important to remember whatever Neptune comes to project in the sign of Aries, Aries is going to take it very far because it's a sign that represents motion. It's going to externalize that energy. And the way it's going to happen is through confrontation and assertion, over assertion, to a point that it becomes self-insertion in some ways. And the way that this usually happens is that we have some unresolved inner contents, some issue. We haven't dealt with it. And instead of dealing with it internally, because it's in the sign of Aries, it's going to externalize that onto another person. So it's going to look at another person and say, you're the type of person who, that should always be like a red flag. When we say that, it's usually not the other person. That's something about us. So this makes some external person or a circumstance into an enemy or an obstacle that has to be confronted and at worst annihilated. And that's because the inner conflicts, our inner conflicts are always trying to find a resolution, and projection is one way of actually making us aware of our unresolved feelings, but unfortunately others become the victim for it because we project it so that we see it. And in the sign of Aries, this is all going to be externalized. So there's a tendency here with this placement for the psyche to constantly take its own inner unrest, project it onto other people, and to see it as unrest outside of itself. It's going to be very common for everyone to look at society and to look at other people and say, they're the problem, they're the problem, they're the problem. And then when you ask them, okay, how do you fit in the equation? You live in the society, you are in this relationship. There is no answer. Everybody else is the problem and they need to be annihilated so that we have a better life. Like, it is creating absolute unnecessary conflict. Like, everyone should just get a counselor or something. And that's because we're going to be fighting representation of our internal worlds outside in the world with the world, as if the outside world can solve those inner conflicts. By defeating them, the subconscious, when it doesn't have enough maturity, it thinks it can overcome itself by doing that, but that never actually resolves anything. And there's another component to this shadow too. Not only it's creating havoc with others, others do not like this quality. So when this happens to them, what do? They also fight back. It's going to be a world that is constantly resisting us, rather than being malleable and adaptable, compromising, or reciprocal. So this just perpetuates conflict. And on a personal level, again, something that Neptune in Aries is going to bring to the forefront is a lot of exhaustion. Because this reminds me of the Bruce Lee movie, Enter the Dragon. Ultimately, what he was fighting was his own inner demons. And you can pretend that you're fighting those inner demons out in the world, but all you're doing is that you're exhausting yourself, the resources around you, other people. It's like being in a perpetual battle that never ends. It will exhaust you and your resources eventually. So it creates a feeling of alienation over time. Like, I don't belong, other people don't belong. This is a huge shadow because one of the things that we want the most in this life is a sense of belonging. But let's go to shadow number 4, and that's when idealism infuses with aggression. And there can be a lot of aggression in the sign of Aries because there's a lot of assertion. So every time something is frustrated, assertion will turn into aggression. And again, because Neptune's bringing that sense of belief and the meaning associated to it, and Aries is bringing the courage and force, aggression can actually start to feel justified with this placement. And what they're generally going to be called is higher ideals, virtues, beliefs, or imagined destinies, individual destinies or destiny of a nation. And if we think about it, this is actually happening because Neptune dissolves moral boundaries while amplifying our conviction behind it. So aggression feels meaningful rather than feeling reactive. It feels like a very justified and objective response, while in reality, it's just a reaction. And the havoc that it's going to create is through escalation. And it's escalating because idealism and passion are becoming infused. And when they're infused, they're very difficult to regulate. Like, the meaning that we might hold and might feel larger than life. Like, this is moral righteousness in some sense, right? Self-righteousness. And under such circumstance, it's very easy to dismiss consequences. And that's because every action is at a service of this symbolic narrative that's bigger than life, most important, more important than anything else. And of course, these symbolic narratives are ideologies, ideals, idealism, beliefs. And we don't need to look far to look at many belief systems currently, and they are very destructive. And these dynamics can manifest in our personal relationships, which become destructive relationships. They create impulsive confrontations, and they can actually become self-sabotaging and other sabotaging dynamics just so that we serve this purpose. And in reality, all of this is eroding stability and coherence over time. And again, Saturn's going to show us this at the beginning for 2.5 years of this, and then we're left to our own vices. Hopefully we've learned by then. But let's move on to shadow number 5. And that's when motion continues without a sense of clarity. And as I said earlier, when Aries initiates motion, and because the sign has a lot of force in it, it maintains its momentum. Aries is actually denoting the initial condition of emotion. On the other hand, what does Neptune do? It dissolves our orientation. So that means when we put Neptune in the sign of Aries, we can continue on a trajectory of action long after the original purpose had dissolved. It's just gone. But we just continue to act, even though we actually don't have a sense of clarity about what we're doing. And this shadow is coming from the fact that we don't realize that so many instances in life, stopping ourselves from doing something actually requires clarity. And Neptune is clouding our perception. So perpetual movement can replace understanding that we desperately need. And again, the havoc here, the shadow, the problem with this, again, it creates exhaustion. It burns our resources. This is an instant when we fill our life with so much activity. Like, you know, those people who are so proud of being busy? I'm always busy. I'm doing stuff. And then when you look at them, it's like, you look like you're struggling. Like, what is this constant effort for? And when you ask them, they can't answer you because the action's not adding to the coherence of their life, is not adding anything more, is not making it better, but they just feel compelled to act. This in reality has another word, which is being lost, getting lost through too many actions. And I would say that this is probably one of the most psychologically draining aspects of this transit. Like that compulsion for us to be busy until 2039. And that's a long time. And when you think about it, what the shadow's trying to reveal to us is where we actually need some discipline, a quality that's very much related to Aries and the ruler of Aries, Mars. It's a discipline to know when it's time to work and when it's time to rest, when it's time to say something and when it's time to be silent. And you know, the transit of Mars while Neptune is in Aries becomes super important. So every time Mars is dignified, Mars is strong, this Neptune's going to behave. It's going to show a little bit more discipline. We're going to show a little bit more discernment. But when, let's say, the sign of Cancer is debilitated, is not dignified, we're going to see ourselves struggling with such themes. So these were the 5 shadows. But now let's go to the life lessons before wrapping up this video. And the life lessons are about how do we gain mastery and not become diffuse and fragmented with this energy in the sign of Aries. I'm going to take a short break. I'll be back to finish this video. All right, guys, I'm back. Not good. I had a piece of bread and it was like full of powder on top of it. As soon as all the powder went up on my nose. Not a good look to have white powder on one's nose. At least not in this type of video, unless it was like Scarface last scene. Yes, I hope there are no more powder. I think I got all of it off. But let's go to the life lessons. So lesson number 1 is about distinguishing impulse from necessity. And as I already mentioned, Neptune amplifies the inner imagery of the mind. And then Aries gives us the impulse to act on it. So mastery here comes from learning how to pause and pause long enough to assess where this urge is coming from, what its objective is. Like, am I acting towards something that's real or this thing that I'm imagining it to be so urgent and real? And you know, in the sign of Aries, having a pause feels like you're being a coward, feels cowardice. But in this case, a pause is showing our discipline. Like, we have to be able to discern what we're fighting for in the sign of Aries. And sometimes the undertaking, the urge that comes that I need to act, they require a pause to see like, okay, I'm going to act. Is going towards that trajectory and that objective that I have, or is just an urge to act? So we have to condition ourselves to that Zen state of mind that sometimes non-action is actually action. And in the sign of Aries, it is one of the most difficult actions you can perform. And the best part is, when our actions arise out of necessity, we'll be able to sustain our energy and not to constantly burn ourselves out. But if we keep acting because we feel compelled to act, actions that are arising from fantasy, imagination, all of these things are going to plummet our energy. And the reason for this is fantasies, the way Neptune represents them, they never have a destination. Never. We can imagine things till the end of our life. You just act and act without ever arriving to a destination. The function of imagination is this. Creativity is this. It creates an ideal that doesn't actually exist in the real world. It can propel us to act, but that should not be the destination. Fantasies never offer us respite and rest, even though we often fantasize about things in life that will get us to a place where we'll be peaceful, where we can finally sit and rest. But in reality, they are an ongoing process where rest does not exist in them. So learning this distinction can stabilize our effort and prevent a lot of burnouts. The second lesson, so important, responsibility for our beliefs. And before going into this, I just realized something. I made 2 movie references, and they're both action movies, Enter the Dragon and Scarface, Neptune, talking about fantasies, movie-like scenarios. Just had to say that. But yes, lesson number 2, responsibility for our beliefs. And that's because our beliefs carry tremendous amount of power. And in the sign of Aries, they're going to be fueled by our actions. So even more important with this placement. So a kind of mastery that we must perform with this transit is to acknowledge our beliefs are never, ever neutral. They're not benign. They actually shape our thoughts, our emotions, psychological states, behaviors, and then they mold our relationship and how we connect to the world and how the world is allowed to connect to us. It shapes the way we show up into the world. And because of this, our beliefs always have consequences. So the lesson here is that we have to sit with our beliefs and examine them regularly. We have to allow our actual lived experiences refine our beliefs. And the thing is, blind belief never stands against the tests of reality. Again, Saturn's going to show us this very early. It actually devolves us. And at this time, we are meant to evolve. And we evolve by being active agents in the world and in our lives. When we have placements in the sign of Aries, it's telling us that we're supposed to cultivate our will and the integrity of our will. And one way to do all of this is to not become ideologically dogmatic. And the way to do that is to examine our beliefs again, often. If someone questions our beliefs, it's good for us not to get defensive, but to actually pause, take a moment, think about it. How is my belief harmful? Even though I feel that is very beneficial. And it's also worth saying that evolution is about constant motion, movements, and it actually requires adaptability. Dogmatic beliefs, on the other hand, create rigidity, and that prevents our growth. So again, worth evaluating often. And this brings us to lesson 3, which is about separating our identity from our belief system. And oh my God, is that ever hard to do? Because some of our belief systems are so entrenched and taken for granted. We don't even understand how much of the way we are, our identities are stemming from these entrenched belief systems. And now you bring Neptune here, which is dissolving boundaries. An Aries that always wants to assert its own selfhood, it becomes even more distorted. And in fact, one way to gain mastery here is to understand that we are the agents that hold beliefs. Beliefs were never meant to hold us. And when we kind of have this paradigm shift, we become conscious of what we believe. We become responsible for the things that we believe, why we believe. We can actually practice being flexible without losing meaning when we have this perspective. Because people talk about their belief like it's a fact of the world. Like, no, it's your belief. And one way to grow through this transit, and it's such a long transit, none of us want to feel static for that time, is to understand how we're identifying ourselves with a certain set of beliefs, how we're embodying them, how they become our identity, and how we're performing them. We need to grow without feeling like we're being suffocated by our beliefs or suffocating other people. And you know, when identity is actually healthy in a human being, there's adaptability in their belief systems. Now let's go to the next lesson, which is about conscious engagement with aggression. Everyone wants to annihilate anger, for example. Anger is a necessary emotion. It's a signal that's telling us something is harmful. And sometimes that aggression is a force that we exert to be able to protect ourselves. But we have to realize how we're engaging with it, how it's engaging us. And I'm saying this because of the force and the impulsivity that's in the sign of Aries. And Aries also represents aggression. Aries is always supplying us with force. And when it comes to Neptune, we're talking about force of meaning. And this is, instead of letting something disclose its meaning for us, we might want to force meaning on it or on other people. This is how you ought to feel. This is what you ought to do. And if you think about it, this is not the usual order of things. This is not how other people in the world work. So it's not going to be uncommon for people to fight with a lot of force and aggression for meaning and the things that they believe. Like, aggression here should be towards things that have a constructive end. And I think we need to be super mindful of the other side of the axis, which is Libra. Sometimes meaning is actually legitimate when we take other people into consideration, and meaning emerges in relation, not in isolation in a vacuum of our own minds. And then the entire world has to correspond. So the energy of Aries here, it's best spent when it produces coherence rather than constant and perpetual conflict. And a lot of the conflicts will come from what we think is the truth. And we're going to have that trine to Jupiter in Leo in the summertime, where we might have very strong convictions of what's true. But Saturn and Ketu will be there to remind us what reality is and where we need to cut it off. We just have to remember what we think is right, what the meaning of a thing is. It's not necessarily universal, like the way Neptune likes to make things into a universal idea. Again, dissolving the boundaries. So I think our gaze should be on what creates coherence. That's Libra axis across Aries. And we should actually be aiming our energy on how to transform raw force into purposeful strength. And let's go to the last lesson, which is related to that previous idea. I was talking about a component of Aries, which has to do with Dharma. And Dharma, again, governs correct actions. But we have to remember Neptune will dissolve clarity. But Aries is going to continuously demand actions, and to act with mastery in the sign of Aries, it's not a one-shot deal. Aries works in spurts: force, speed, power, and burst, rest, reignite, reignite. So this is an opportunity. When I was talking about a pause, it feels unnatural in the sign of Aries. But after that burst, there's a combustion. There's a moment of pause before ignition. Those are the moments we should actually take to examine how we're acting. Are we aligned? That's a moment for realignment. And the way to realign with Neptune in the sign of Aries is to constantly ask ourselves, is this action actually necessary? Or is it again serving some imagination or some desire that I have, some belief that I have? And one way to assess actions to see if we're aligned or not, some actions give us very instant consequences. To actually sit with those consequences. If I repeat this action, I'm going to have the same thing happen again. Do I want that? If not, then we're misaligned and we need to course correct. And we have to remember with this Dharma concept of Aries, when we are aligned, when our actions aligned to who we essentially are, we're going to stay on a right trajectory. The inaction and the action of the self is the right action. And we have to remember that this is one of the most important components of life. It's actually what will ultimately define if we lived a good life, a life worth living or not. And it's worth remembering, integrity matters more than intensity, that busyness. Quality matters more than quantity. So when actions align with Dharma, even the most difficult situation in life will have coherence. We're not going to lose our heads. We're not going to project. And understanding our Dharma in general makes us unshakable and unbreakable. And now we are arriving towards the end of the video. And before closing this video, if you like the content of this video, please do remember to like, subscribe, and share, as well as your comments. We have a long journey ahead. I hope we get to share a lot of stories about this Neptune in Aries when Saturn moves in here, when we have that trine, the sextile right away that I'll be making with Pluto, and so much more. I'd love to hear from you guys. Leave your comments. And I want you guys to know that is not lost on me that this channel is growing because of your involvement, engagement, and participation. And I'm absolutely grateful to you because it's allowing me to do what I love, and I hope it's contributing something to your lives. And if you want a reading of your own charts of this transit or the beautiful blueprint that's been designated to you and what it all means in your journey, you can go to the email in the description box below or to Parisa Yazdi for more information. I will also upload an article about this video on the same website. And now to close the video. As Neptune enters Aries in January 2026, something is being asked of existence itself. And I say this because cycles do not unfold randomly. These signatures don't appear without necessity. I feel that when a symbol enters time, is because it's time for a certain quality, for a certain state, mode, and mood to manifest. It's telling us that existence is ready for beliefs, imaginations, and meanings to move, for the internal content of our lives to externalize themselves and to manifest externally. It's signaling it to us right now. Things were gestating in the sign of Pisces. Now they want an expression through choice, agency, courage, will, and our initiation. They want to be enacted. Potential wants to become manifest. And because this is Aries, existence is telling us, I will not carry this forward on your behalf. You're the one who must enact them. But Saturn coming here is also showing us how to be a responsible agent for the action and externalization of these inner imaginings. By the virtue of the fact that this is occurring in the sign of Aries, existence is telling us that our participation right now is necessary. Our decision-making is required. It is requiring ownership of our sense of direction. And in a lot of ways, when it's all said and done, this transit is showing us what it means to be responsible for our internal content and how we bring them out into the world. We are responsible for what we imagine and what we believe. We always think these are our internal contents, but they seep out. And in the sign of Aries, they seep out forcefully. And we have to remember Neptune here is dissolving a lot of certainty. And yet Aries at the same time is demanding a lot of action. So that means we have ultra responsibility, uber responsibility to understand the path as it unfolds in front of us and how we act through it, how we shape it, and how it's shaping us. We have to consciously engage with it and move through it consciously. And we also have to make some concession for the things that want to move through us, like our imagination. Right now, as of January 26 of 2026, that's a tongue twister. Each of us is becoming an active agent in what will take shape in the world, that potential that's in the background that's just lurking there, and it wants to express itself and manifest. We are its creator now. We are giving shape and form, and then it's going to live. And Neptune's going to show us that once when it moves into the sign of Taurus. And I want us to remember, existence right now is not asking us for perfection. It rarely does. What it wants from us is alignment. Alignment between what we believe and what we act. Alignment between imagination and consequences. Alignment between inner necessity and outward motion. This is the moment when paths are chosen through action itself. And because Aries governs beginnings, what gets started now, it cannot be undone. So the direction that we take right now matters a lot. And again, we will see the result of this in 2038 to 2039. And I think one thing that's worth keeping with us throughout this transit is not just about, what did we believe in so strongly? Or did I believe enough? Did I imagine boldly enough? But rather, whether if that path that we initiate can carry the weight of reality as it unfolds. And again, Saturn is going to show us what all of this means. And my wish for this transit is this. May we recognize what existence is asking of us, and may our choices move in alignment with that call. That's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.